Coming soon to VHS.
I am a huge Indy fan, to the extent that I have the original Hollywood red carpet marquee poster for Raiders of the Lost Ark, and am buying a new console purely to play the new Indiana Jones game coming out later this year. I love Indiana Jones, and was so excited that I get to cover one of these movies in this series. Until I saw which one it was. I know I'm going to get a little bit of backlash for saying this given the fandom's split opinion on this movie, but I am not as big a fan of Temple of Doom compared to Indy's other films. In fact, it is my least favorite of the original trilogy, and tied for my least favorite in the overall 5-movie series. However, there is just so much cinema trivia behind this film that's absolutely fascinating. This episode is going to be another one of those where there is far too much for me to be able to cover, but I'm going to have a ton of fun cramming all that I can into it. You can bet your sweet buns I'm going to sing its praises where I can, because I am a biased fangirl. But, by that same token, I may be a little more savage on where it falls short because I know it could have been so much better. Sorry, Indy, I may be a huge fan of yours, but I acknowledge this movie's shortcomings. So, without further ado, let's kick off our May movies with Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. In the year 1935, 1 year prior to the events of Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones finds himself stranded in India along orphan sidekick Short Round and nightclub singer Willie Scott after narrowly escaping a not-so-accidental plane crash. After listening to the plight of a small ruined village on their way to Delhi, the trio embark on a perilous quest to the formidable Pankot Palace to reclaim the village's kidnapped children and their stolen sacred stone. Though all seems well at first glance, Indiana uncovers a secret cult beneath the palace set on finding all 5 of the sacred stones and using their power to overthrow opposing nations and religions alike, while forcing the kidnapped children to do their evil bidding. After harrowing misadventures and a battle against the cultists, Indiana sends the cult into ruin and escapes with the freed children and recovered sacred stone. This film had 11 wins and 22 nominations. One of its most notable wins an Oscar for Best Visual Effects, and I cannot agree more with this win. This film's effects were such a far cry better from Raiders of the Lost Ark, it's pretty hard not to notice, especially if you watch these movies back to back. I mean, who can forget the face melting scene at the end of the first movie? If you put that scene side by side with the scene of Mola Ram, played by Amrish Puri, tearing out the heart of the sacrificial victim beneath Pankot Palace, its improvement is undeniable. The lava pit of doom that said sacrifice was lowered into moments afterwards was also super advanced for its time, and again, so much better than the stormy clouds, ghostly entities, and waves of fire emerging from the Ark in the first film. The Temple of Doom team also managed to pull off scaling water effects in the mine shaft sequence as well, a feat that's always been super difficult to pull off in cinema. Well, anytime you have to deal with water, be it animating the stupid thing or working with the actual liquid, it's a royal pain in the ass. So hats off to them for making it work, and so well. Of course, there's no way you can overlook the phenomenal score by John Williams. Anything he does is practically guaranteed to become a hit, and Indy's theme, along with the rest of the score, is no different. It's fun, it makes you feel like you're a part of this adventure with this classic hero, and there's never a dull point in his work. George Lucas, no stranger to John Williams' work, was also brought on this film as executive producer. Between his, John Williams, and Harrison Ford's work on Star Wars, naturally there was bound to be some Star Wars Easter eggs thrown in. My favorite one was probably at the beginning of the film in the nightclub, which was called Club Obi-Wan. Part of the sound effect for the doors to the lava pit opening was the sound of Darth Vader's lightsaber powering on, and Han Solo's Millennium Falcon can be heard in the plane crash scene. The same noise it makes in Episode 5 when it fails to start up is part of the failing engine sound the plane makes as the engines run out of fuel. As a mega Star Wars fan, I couldn't help but geek out over everything that made it into this movie, even though Harrison Ford isn't all that much of a fan of his character, Han Solo, or a lot of Star Wars for that matter. And of course, Steven Spielberg's involvement is everything. Like John Williams, this man is an icon, and any movie he's a part of is going to turn heads. Despite all of these big-name movie icons, however, this movie was pretty problematic. For starters, it was Temple of Doom and Gremlins actually, both directed or produced respectively by Steven Spielberg and released the same year in 1984, that changed the Motion Picture Association movie rating criteria. Before these movies were released, there were only 4 ratings: G, PG, R, and X, now known as NC-17, which is rarely ever used. Temple of Doom was rated PG and caused a huge uproar because of how violent and graphic it was for a PG rating, yet I think we can all agree that this is nowhere near the realm of needing to be rated R. The child abuse, heart-ripping out scene, and the elevated violence was too much for a lot of kids, and it was actually Spielberg himself that went to the president of the MPA to prevent this issue from happening again in the future. Spielberg told President Jack Valenti, quote, "Let's get a rating somewhere between PG and R," end quote, and lo and behold, the first PG-13 movie was released that same year, later that summer. No joke, if you go out and Google what is Temple of Doom rated or what is Gremlins rated, the first thing that pops up on both searches is how it changed the MPA ratings. So, you can thank Steven for taking responsibility and looking out for the younger audience out there. I don't think such a huge change would have happened near as quickly without someone of his caliber stepping forward to make it happen, and I personally think it's hecking awesome that he essentially wielded his almighty Spielberg powers for good. Though that's super awesome and all, this was just one happy ending to one debacle. A pretty big one is that this movie managed to piss off an entire country. India did not take too kindly to this film when it first hit the theaters. Scratch that, they still don't. The Temple of Doom is outright banned in India and has never been aired on Indian TV channels. I mean, the filmmakers for this movie weren't able to get filming rights in the country because the script was controversial enough. After having read the script, the Indian government demanded the word Maharaja was removed from it and stated that the content did not reflect their culture. Though I am not a citizen of India, I have to agree with their worries. This movie very clearly has no intention of adhering to or showing much in the ways of cultural respect. You have Mola Ram's cow skull headwear, which is sacrilegious to Hinduism, where cows are viewed as sacred. The issue of British colonialism brought up around the middle of the film and is essentially later glorified near the end when the British-led Indian troops swoop in to round up the cultists, and almost everything is culturally incorrect or twisted to fit this Hollywood film. Just look at the dining scene at Pankot Palace. Yes, the eyeball soup, chilled monkey brains, and live eels meant to be baby snakes cut out of a larger snake were supposed to be more comedic to American viewers, but realistically, it's pretty low to be making fun of an entire culture by depicting them so grossly and inappropriately inaccurate. And that was just one singular example. The movie also did them the injustice of having the big strong white man come in to save the day. From the villagers all crowded around Indy pleading on their knees in the beginning, and once again crowding to applaud and cheer him and his blonde counterpart at the end, the movie sets up and closes with this gross sense of white superiority painfully shoved into the audience's face. And again, the British Captain Blumbert leading the troop of Indian soldiers at the end just really rubs salt in the wounds. Lots of things shove salt in the wound, not just these examples alone. And there were adjustments that could have been made to change a lot of this unfortunate dynamic in this movie, even if the story is still about a white adventurer. I wish it was the king that was the one to walk over the hill with those troops instead of Blumbert. Sure, corruption had been a factor in the kingdom, but with the king freed and with this change leading the troops to capture their oppressors, it would have given the impression that this kingdom was already on the path to healing and capable of taking care of its own issues instead of needing the British there to keep an eye over them like they're incapable. I wish Indy had shown up unceremoniously for directions and left the village just as quietly like he does on all of his other adventures. One of the things I love about Indiana Jones is that he never looks for thanks or gratitude, he just does it for the artifacts, and the endings always reflect that. This one just lumped him in with a cinematic band of white adventuring jerk faces. I wish they had tried to make this movie more culturally appropriate and respectful, but they just didn't do that. Even a few people on the production team have said that the movie turned out differently from what was originally envisioned, but from what I've read, that unfortunately does not include being more respectful towards the Indian culture. Everything seems to be about how dark the film is in comparison to the first movie, which again changed the rating system. More focus is on the child slavery aspect, the issue consciously decided on as one of the main threads, then cultural insensitivity, the issue done without much thought to it at all. George Lucas talked about how the film was far darker than he intended because both he and Steven Spielberg were going through breakups at the time? Note to self, don't ever make a movie in the middle of post-breakup angst. The vibe was so bad in some scenes that Spielberg ended up having to go into several scenes to add comedic bits to try and soften the tone of what was going on. A prime example of this was the scene where Indy fights the cultist guard with the hammer. The guard ends up grabbing the hammer and tosses it aside, only for it to land on a bystander's head with a comedic thud and knocking him out. This scene was actually a parallel to the scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark, where Indy fights the Nazi mechanic on the airfield while trying to free Marianne from the plane. Not to mention, the mechanic and the guard were played by the same actor. There were a couple of callbacks to the first film, actually. The two most noticeable probably the scene of Indy retrieving the glowing sacred stones in the cultist lair, mirroring the opening scene in Raiders where he tries to swap the glowing golden idol with a sandbag, and the scene where Indy tries to pull his missing gun on the two swordsmen on the cliff, much like he does in the streets of Cairo in the basket chase sequence in the first one. And to me, these were the most fun scenes. Not just the callback scenes, but the injected humor bits too. Though I think Indiana Jones is a badass, his movies always have a comedic undertone because he is just a normal guy managing to somehow, some way, make it through these crazy situations. There are tons of mishaps along the way, making him so much more relatable, and this movie just didn't execute that quite as well. And that isn't just a hot take on my end, both Lucas and Spielberg have said as much. And it dragged, so much more than the other two in the original trilogy. But that's a me opinion, not a Lucas and Spielberg opinion. Well, that may not just be an opinion strictly relegated to me. An article from the New York Times written back in 1984 went so far as to say, and I quote, "Unlike Raiders, this new movie's script never quite transcends the schlocky B-movie manners that inspired it. Though it looks as if it'd cost a fortune, Indiana Jones doesn't go anywhere, possibly because it's composed entirely of a succession of climaxes. It could end at any point with nothing essential being lost." Hate my more unfavorable opinion on the sequel all you want, the New York Times makes me feel a little more validated in it. I don't think the author Vincent Canby could have summed up my thoughts more precisely on how interminable some scenes felt. I mean, we even had an ever-dragging car chase scene, but with minecarts. And had the Chinese government not refused to allow the filming of it, there would have been a motorcycle chase scene across the Great Wall of China. Thank you, but the minecarts were enough. I know it had to be more action-heavy to make up for the very weak plot, but even then the plot was just too weak. And introduced horribly, might I add. You would think that the reason for the weeping and crying villagers, or the reason the village head and shaman sends Indy off on this quest would be to save the children, but no, it's for their stone. You go through an entire sequence where they're telling him that in order to save the village from ruin, he's supposed to reclaim their stolen stone, and he's really not all that interested until way later, at the end of the scene, the shaman tells him that the children were kidnapped. It was very much a, go get our stone. Oh, also, they took our children. What? It's clear Indiana can speak their language, so he would have picked up if the massive forlorn villagers were talking about their missing children, but that was not the case. I'd like to try and give them the benefit of the doubt and say they were maybe saying more generic pleas for help, as I do not speak the language they were speaking, but if my child were kidnapped, I think that's what would be coming out of my mouth before anything else. Maybe I'm just being a little more harsh here. Either way, Temple of Doom was just a little too dark and not as well paced as it could have been, as proven by both Raiders of the Lost Ark and The Last Crusade. And then there's the characters, or rather, one in particular, that really makes you question why you wanted to watch this in the first place. I'm sorry, Kate Capshaw, but you weren't a fan of your character either. This movie may not have been the best, but if you took out Willie Scott, it would have been so much better. She is easily the worst of Indiana Jones' love interests, and I don't even want to call her a love interest because outside of the awkwardly forced physical attraction, they very clearly hated one another. There was zero chemistry between the two of them, even during the whole "you'll be back over here in my room in 5 minutes" scene, which might have been funny if the love interest was literally anybody else. He's constantly fed up with her antics throughout the entire duration of the film, and she doesn't ever seem to get it through her clueless head the kind of situation that she's in. Willie Scott is one of the worst dumb blonde stereotyped characters I've had the misfortune of sitting through. It really was like they were gunning for the worst of the worst with her, though for what reason I cannot even fathom. She was irritating, she whined and complained relentlessly, she was a master at making a fool out of herself, and she screamed a grand sum total of 71 times throughout the movie. I did not like Willie in the slightest, but I have so much respect for her actress Kate, who was very much aware of what her character was, and has also gone on to say that Willie was not much more than a dumb, screaming blonde. And I cannot fault her for taking this role either. I think if I was offered the role of the leading lady in the Indiana Jones sequel, I would have jumped at the opportunity without much of a second thought as well, because I loved the first movie so much. I have zero doubt what she performed was the direction they told her to go in, but a part of me wonders how much of the script they actually gave her. That scene where Willie and Short Round are hanging on the broken bridge at the end, watching Indiana Jones try to fend off Mola Ram, and the way she just keeps repeating, "oh my god," over and over again, sounded like there was a whole bunch of empty air that she needed to fill with something, but they just didn't script her with anything, and that's what she ended up going with. Kate did try, despite what little substance she was given to work with. She had to be taught how to scream, and she pulled it off. 71 times in the film, and God knows how many times during scrapped scenes and outtakes. She was actually covered with over 2,000 live insects for the spiked chamber sequence, and freaked out over having to film it so badly that she had to take sedatives prior to said scene, but she did the damn thing. That minecart chase scene landed her a black eye, to which the crew honored her by wearing black smudges underneath their eyes the next day. Despite the airhead she was supposed to play, the woman did a lot that she had to brave through. It just sucks that her character sucked to the point that I wish they'd left her out entirely and kept Short Round as Indiana's only companion in this movie. I know. This was made in the era where it was almost required for all action heroes to have that pretty love interest sidekick. I just think that Ke Huy Quan, the actor that played Short Round, had such good chemistry with Harrison Ford that it made Willie's character all the more abysmal when put side by side. I mean, he and Harrison Ford improv the entire cheating card game sequence by the campfire because the two did so well together. This was also his first film, amazingly enough, and one where he hadn't originally meant to try out for, by the way. But he did so well in this movie that he managed to rake in a nominee for Best Performance by a Young Actor and a win for Best Young Supporting Actor. Still, I have to mention that Short Round was riddled with Chinese stereotypes, which unfortunately cheapened the character despite Ke Hui's fantastic performance. The only time I found his character a little more on the annoying side was when they just had to fling in something more racist or stereotyped. But that was at no fault to Ke Huy. He was absolutely great and adorable, and I wish they could have written him as just a kid who happens to be Chinese instead of a Chinese stereotype kid. But, as seen in the entire India debacle as discussed earlier, clearly no damns were given about any of that. Still, I will die on this hill. Short Round is the superior companion to Indy, and I think Kate Capshaw would even agree with me. I also have to mention that it's always super gratifying to see a child actor grow up to have a successful adult career because that just rarely seems to ever happen. Between his recent huge roles in Loki and Everything Everywhere All at Once, I'd say Ke Hui's more recognizable in the average household than ever. And can I just say, seeing him and Harrison Ford at the Oscars where Everything Everywhere All at Once absolutely swept, including his winning Best Supporting Actor, was hecking amazing, and no, I did not cry, you cried. Last but not least is Indiana Jones himself, and fortunately his character wasn't screwed over as much as the other two were. I have no doubt that a huge part of that is Harrison loving and being super familiar with his character enough that he would be able to make really anything work though. As discussed earlier, it sucks that he had to be turned into one of those saved by the white man heroes, but I'm not going to spend any more time on that here. I think one of the other borderline character inconsistencies that I had a problem with was the implication that he was going on this adventure for fame and glory, something Willie liked to keep throwing in his face every so often, but I don't entirely think that was the case. Like I mentioned before, Indy does everything he does to recover artifacts and is a huge history junkie, never really caring about said fame and glory. Yes, he does perk up a little bit at the initial mentioning of it in the beginning of the film, which I found kind of odd, but he's still not really sold on going to Pankot Palace until the missing children are mentioned. I think the repeated mentioning of it is more so because Willie misunderstood his intentions, being obsessed with fame and glory herself as a famous nightclub singer, but I really wanted to address it because there were some scenes that made it seem like that could very well have been the case, but there were still others that followed his "it belongs in a museum" creed. But I do appreciate how Indy acknowledges at the end that it'd end up as a useless rock in a museum instead of serving its actual purpose where it is still needed. Not yet forgotten history, so not yet needed in a museum, so to speak. So now I have to move on to the Does It Hold Up Today segment of this episode, and I'm sure you're all thinking it's going to be short and sweet and to the point, but not for this one it isn't. Remember how I said the fandom's pretty split on its opinion of this movie? Well, that's why. My response is no. I do not think this movie holds up all that well today. Go back to any one of my negative points and that's why. But I'm baffled because even though it was not received well in the 80s, it's become stupidly more well received in recent years. It was abysmally slammed by critics and disliked by audiences when it was released in the 80s, but with the 82% audience score and certified fresh rating of 77% on Rotten Tomatoes, you wouldn't have guessed that. Have I somehow been watching a different movie from the one that's being reviewed on Rotten Tomatoes? I mean, it has to be. There has to be another Temple of Doom with the same actors because I just don't get it. I feel like I've woken up in a different dimension or universe or something because I really do not get how this movie has gotten such good recent reviews. Steven Spielberg himself has said, and not 5 years after this film was made, might I add, that he did not like Temple of Doom at all and that it had none of his own personal feelings in it. He's also boldly declared that the best thing to come out of it was him meeting Kate Capshaw, who later became his wife. Kate Capshaw was slammed over and over and over again for her role in this film, and at one point during an episode of The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson that she was a guest on, had to step in and say, "Please don't talk about me like I'm not here. I am here," when critics Siskel and Ebert had nothing nice to say about her performance. The New York Times article I brought up earlier was just one of many of its nature, and I will absolutely add the link to it below because holy hell, there are some brutal lines in it. Yet, Rotten Tomato reviewers are calling this the best Indiana Jones of the original trilogies and singing all kinds of outlandish praises, and I just cannot wrap my head around it. You also have Quentin Tarantino declaring this film as Spielberg's second best film and his own personal favorite in the series. He also said that there's a, quote, ultimate comedy aspect that's just not quite there as much in the first one, end quote, and for the life of me, I have no idea what he's talking about. I must be crazy, or it's a whole ploy by Rotten Tomatoes to make me believe that I've gone insane. And it's working so well. That's not to say that there aren't a couple of the real ones mixed in there that are just as heckin' confused as I am. Stay strong, friends, you're not alone. I think you get the gist, so let's talk numbers. With a budget of $28,170,000, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom generated an overall domestic revenue of $179,870,271 at the box office. Indy also swung his way to first place in the highest monthly earnings as well, with May earnings at $51,737,827, making this our first movie in the 80s group to win both categories. Congrats, Dr. Jones! I am bracing myself for all of the Rotten Tomatoes reviewers to enter the comments, but I am genuinely curious about how you feel about this movie. Did I leave out your favorite bit of Temple of Doom trivia? Would you need sedatives to be able to film a scene covered in over 2,000 bugs, do it without them, or bail altogether? Do you think you could have driven a minecart better? Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next week in 1994.
We are going to die!